You think the fear of being ordinary is about ambition, about drive, about the healthy refusal to settle for a life that doesn't matter. You think it is a feature, the thing that pushes you to do more, be more, become more, or you think it is a flaw, a sign of insecurity, ego, of an unhealthy need for validation that you should have outgrown by now. It is neither, and the story you are telling yourself about it, whichever version you are telling, is getting in the way of understanding what it actually is. The fear of being ordinary is not a personality trait. It is not a motivational style. It is a neurological response to a set of social conditions that did not exist for any human being on Earth until approximately 200 years ago. Your ancestors did not fear being ordinary. They could not. The category did not exist for them in the way it exists for you. What changed, what produced this specific, modern, grinding anxiety, is not a shift in human nature. It is a shift in the environment that human nature is running in. And once you understand that shift, the fear stops feeling like something wrong with you and starts feeling like something wrong with the world you were handed. Start with the question that most conversations about this fear never ask. Not how to overcome it, not how to make peace with it. Where did it come from? The fear of being ordinary feels ancient because it feels biological. It feels like something the body produces. And because it feels biological, it feels like yours. Like something about you specifically that requires either fixing or accepting. But here is what the historical record shows, and this is the part that changes the story you have been telling yourself. For most of human history, for the vast majority of the 300,000 years your species has existed, identity was not something you constructed. It was something you inherited. You were a farmer's son or a blacksmith's daughter or a merchant's apprentice. Your place in the social order was assigned, not achieved. It was given to you by the circumstances of your birth, the community you were embedded in, the role that the structure of your world had already prepared for you before you arrived. And a place that is assigned cannot be ordinary or extraordinary. It can only be fulfilled or failed. The blacksmith who makes good iron is a good blacksmith. The question of whether being a blacksmith is a sufficiently remarkable way to spend a life, whether it will be remembered, whether it compares favorably to every other possible life, whether it constitutes enough, that question does not arise. Not because the people of earlier centuries lacked the intelligence to ask it, but because the conditions that make the question meaningful did not exist. You cannot be ordinary or extraordinary in a world where your identity is not a competition. And for most of human history, identity was not a competition. It was an inheritance. The anxiety of being ordinary requires a world in which identity is something you build rather than something you receive. And that world is approximately 200 years old. This is the first head fake the history delivers. The fear did not begin with social media. It did not begin with television or celebrity culture or the influencer economy. It began with something much older and much more structural. The Industrial Revolution, the collapse of fixed social roles, the migration of populations from small, embedded communities into large, anonymous cities, and the emergence of a world in which who you were was no longer given to you at birth, but was something you had to construct, justify, and perform for an audience that had no prior relationship with you and no obligation to be generous in its judgment. What does that feel like from the inside? Think about what it means to move from a world of 50 people who have known you your entire life, who have context for who you are, who remember your childhood and your failures and your recovery from them, into a city of 50,000 strangers who know nothing about you except what you present in the moment of encounter. In the small world, your identity is held by the community. It is distributed. You do not have to perform it continuously because the people around you already know it. In the large anonymous world, you are the sole custodian of your own identity. You must present it, maintain it, and defend it continuously. And continuously is exhausting. And exhaustion, over time, produces anxiety. And anxiety, looking for a cause, finds the most available one. The possibility that what you are presenting is not enough. That the identity you have constructed is not sufficiently remarkable to justify the attention you are asking for from people who do not know you and do not owe you anything. But the collapse of the fixed social role, as significant as it is, still does not fully explain the specific modern intensity of the fear of being ordinary, because that intensity has been accelerating in a way that the Industrial Revolution alone cannot account for. And the acceleration points towards something that arrived later and has been compounding ever since. The comparison machine. Psychologist Leon Festinger, working in the 1950s, developed what he called social comparison theory, the finding that human beings evaluate their own abilities, opinions, and worth not against any objective standard but against the people around them. This is not a modern pathology. It is a feature of human social cognition that is older than language. The problem is not that humans compare themselves to others. The problem is the radical expansion of the comparison pool. For most of human history, the pool of people you could compare yourself to was your immediate social world. 40 people, maybe 100. You could be the best farmer in the village or the worst, but you could not be compared to every farmer who had ever lived. You could not, in the same Tuesday afternoon, encounter the most beautiful person you had ever seen, the most successful person you had ever heard of, the most creative, the most adventurous, the most loved. The comparison pool was bounded by the physical limits of your world, and a bounded comparison pool is a survivable one. What happens to the social comparison system when the comparison pool expands from 50 people to 5 billion? The brain does not scale. The social comparison mechanism was calibrated for a small world. It was built to evaluate your standing within a group that you could actually influence and belong to. And when you ask a system built for 50 people to process a comparison pool of 5 billion, the system does not upgrade, it breaks. Here is where psychologist Sherry Turkle at MIT adds something critical to the picture. The expansion of the comparison pool does not just increase the intensity of social comparison. It changes its nature. In a small social world, comparison was calibrated by context. You knew the person you were comparing yourself to. You knew their circumstances, their struggles, the private failures that preceded the visible success. In an expanded social world, and especially in a world of curated digital presentation, the comparison is made against a performance. Against the version of a person that has been selected, filtered, and optimized for public consumption. You are comparing your interior experience to someone else's exterior presentation. The best version of someone else's life, photographed at the best angle, posted on the best day, and the interior always loses that comparison, not because it is worse, because it is real. And this is where the specific fear of being ordinary becomes fully visible. Because the curated exterior presentation is not just better than your interior experience. It is more legible, more narratable, more clearly organized around the markers of a life that matters. The visible evidence that a life is being lived in a way that justifies its existence. And when you spend enough time consuming the curated exterior presentations of enough other people, your own interior experience, which is messy and contradictory and full of ordinary days that do not organize themselves into a narrative of exceptionalism, begins to feel not just worse, but structurally deficient. Like a life that is missing something, like ordinariness. What you are actually experiencing is not ordinariness. You are experiencing the gap between real life and performed life, between the inside of a life and the outside, between what it actually feels like to be a person and what it looks like to be a person when you are showing only the parts that make the best case for yourself. But the brain does not always make that distinction. And when it doesn't, the gap gets filed under the wrong category. It gets filed under ordinary. This is the point at which sociologist Erving Goffman's observation about the permanent audience becomes most important. For most of human history, the performance of identity was finite. It happened in specific contexts with specific people, and then it ended. There was a backstage, a private self that was not under continuous observation and judgment. The digital age did not just expand the comparison pool, it eliminated the backstage, or made its boundaries radically uncertain. The performance is now potentially always on. The audience is potentially always present. And a brain that is always performing, that can never fully step out of the evaluation of how it appears, is a brain under continuous, low-grade stress. Not the acute stress of immediate danger. The chronic stress of unresolvable evaluation. The stress of a threat that never fully arrives and never fully resolves. And this is the cost that most conversations about the fear of being ordinary never name. Neuroscientist Bruce McEwen spent decades studying what he called allostatic load, the cumulative biological cost of sustained stress on the body and brain. His research found that chronic social stress, the kind that comes from persistent status threat, from continuous evaluation, from the unresolvable anxiety of a comparison pool that never closes, produces measurable changes in the brain's architecture. The fear of being ordinary, if it is sustained and chronic, does not just feel bad. It costs you the cognitive resources you would need to do the things that would actually make you feel less ordinary. It is a trap that tightens the more you struggle against it in the wrong direction. And the wrong direction is achievement. This is the final head fake the research delivers. And it is the one that matters most for what you do next. Psychologist Sonia Lyubomirsky's research on the hedonic treadmill found something that should change how you think about the relationship between achievement and the fear of being ordinary. Achievement changes the baseline against which future achievement is measured. The person who becomes extraordinary does not stop fearing being ordinary. They simply move the threshold of what ordinary means. The writer who publishes a book fears being the writer who published only one. The entrepreneur who builds a company fears building only a small one. The person who achieves the thing that was supposed to resolve the fear discovers, on the other side of the achievement, that the fear has updated its definition of ordinary to include everything they have just accomplished. Because the fear was never about the achievement, it was about the audience. And the audience does not close. So, what is available? If the antidote is not becoming extraordinary, if achievement is a treadmill rather than a destination, what do you do with a fear that is structural, historical, and neurologically real? The answer that the research points toward is not a solution. It is a reorientation. The fear of being ordinary is produced by a specific cognitive framework. The framework of the unlimited comparison pool in the permanent audience. The framework that evaluates your life against all possible lives simultaneously. The framework that treats your worth as a function of your legibility to people who do not know you and your performance relative to a field that has no boundaries. Your brain was designed for a world where your worth was legible to the people who actually knew you, where the comparison pool was bounded by the physical limits of community, where the question of whether your life mattered was answered not by strangers on the internet, but by the specific faces of the specific people you were embedded with, where being present, fully, reliably, specifically present, in a limited world was not ordinary. It was the whole point. The recovery is not a strategy, it is a return. Not to the pre-industrial village. That world is gone and you cannot go back to it. But to the cognitive framework that made the question of being ordinary irrelevant. The framework of the finite, the bounded, the specific. The few people whose judgment of you is informed by actual knowledge of you rather than curated performance. The work that matters to you rather than the work that is most legible to an unlimited audience. The days that feel full not because they are remarkable but because they are yours. Your ancestors did not fear being ordinary, not because they lacked ambition or depth or the desire to matter, but because the question was not available to them in the form it is available to you. They were embedded in specific relationships, specific places, specific communities, contexts that gave their lives meaning, not through comparison to an unlimited field, but through the quality of their presence in a limited one. The fear of being ordinary is the tax you pay for living in a world without edges. A world in which the comparison pool is unlimited and the audience is always watching, and the question of whether you matter is never fully resolved because there is always someone to compare yourself to who seems to matter more. That is not a personal failure, it is a design problem, and you did not design it, you were handed it. The question is not how to become extraordinary within it. It is whether you can find, inside the noise of a world that has forgotten how to be finite, something that feels like enough. Not because you have stopped caring, but because you have remembered, or perhaps discovered for the first time, what caring was originally for. Not performance, not legibility, not the judgment of an audience that does not know you. The specific, irreplaceable, unremarkable fact of being alive in a particular place with particular people on a particular ordinary day that will not be photographed or remembered or compared to anything. That is where the fear ends. Not an achievement. Infinitude. in the radical, quietly revolutionary act of deciding that the audience that matters is small enough to actually see you.